In the winter of 1547, the corridors of Whitehall Palace reeked of decay. The stench emanated not from the kitchens or stables, but from the king's own chambers, where Henry VIII lay dying in a state of grotesque physical deterioration. The man who had danced through his early reign as a Renaissance prince had become a bloated, ulcerated, and literally rotting monarch, whose body had become a prison of pain and putrefaction. When Henry VIII ascended to the throne in 1509 at 17, he embodied the Renaissance ideal of kingship. Contemporary accounts describe a young man of imposing stature, over 6 feet tall in an era when the average man stood barely 5.5 feet, with auburn hair, fair complexion, and an athletic build that made him the envy of European courts. The Venetian ambassador Sebastian Giustinian wrote admiringly of the young king's extremely fine calf and noted that he was much handsomer than any other sovereign in Christendom. Henry threw himself into physical pursuits with characteristic intensity. He excelled at tennis, wrestling, archery, and dancing, often exhausting multiple partners in succession. But it was in the tournament ground that Henry truly shone. Jousting became his consuming passion, and contemporary accounts describe a king who would ride daily, sometimes for hours, perfecting his technique and seeking ever greater challenges. This physical vigor was not merely recreational, it was political. In an age where royal authority rested heavily on personal presence and martial prowess, Henry's athletic achievements reinforced his legitimacy and inspired awe among his subjects. However, the very activities that established Henry's reputation would ultimately destroy his body. The repeated trauma of jousting took a cumulative toll that would manifest catastrophically in later years. The first serious warning came in March 1524, when Henry suffered a significant jousting accident, his opponent's lance striking his helmet's visor and stunning him into brief unconsciousness. Though he recovered quickly, this incident marked the beginning of a pattern of increasingly serious injuries. The turning point came with precision, January 24, 1536. On this day, at a tournament in Greenwich, Henry suffered the catastrophic accident that would transform him from an athletic king into a walking medical catastrophe. During what should have been a routine joust against Sir Henry Norris, Henry's massive destrier stumbled and fell, crushing the heavily armoured king beneath its nearly 1-ton weight. For 2 hours, Henry lay unconscious, his courtiers fearing he was dead. When he finally awakened, he seemed initially to recover, but the damage was catastrophic and largely invisible. The accident crushed Henry's left leg, creating wounds that would never properly heal. More significantly, it appears to have caused a severe brain injury that fundamentally altered his personality. Before 1536, while Henry could be ruthless when necessary, he was generally regarded as intelligent, charismatic, and capable of genuine affection. After the accident, he became increasingly paranoid, violent, and erratic. The charming prince had been replaced by a tyrant whose mood swings terrorized his court. Within months of the accident, putrid wounds had opened on both legs that would discharge foul-smelling pus for the remainder of his life. The Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapuis wrote that the king's legs were covered with open sores that emitted such a powerful stench that courtiers could barely stand to be in his presence. The ulcers would periodically close, only to burst open again with renewed virulence, releasing torrents of infected material that stained Henry's clothing and fouled the air around him. The psychological impact of these wounds cannot be overstated. Henry, who had defined himself through physical prowess, now found his body betraying him daily. The man who had once danced until dawn now struggled to walk short distances without pain. This humiliation likely contributed to the increasingly vicious nature of his later reign, as he sought to reassert dominance through cruelty when physical intimidation was no longer possible. Modern medical researchers have extensively analyzed Henry's symptoms, painting a picture of multiple serious conditions that interacted catastrophically. The chronic leg ulcers were most likely varicose ulcers caused by chronic venous insufficiency. The 1536 jousting accident damaged blood vessels in his legs, preventing proper circulation and leading to tissue death constantly infected with putrid discharge. Recent genetic analysis suggests he may have had McLeod syndrome, a rare X-linked genetic disorder affecting blood and nervous system, explaining his apparent infertility, progressive neurological decline, and increasingly erratic behavior. The brain injury from the 1536 accident likely caused additional neurological problems. Contemporary accounts describe personality changes consistent with traumatic brain injury, including increased aggression, paranoia, and emotional instability. Some historians argue that Henry essentially became a different person after the accident, transformed from a Renaissance prince into a murderous tyrant by literal brain damage. By the 1540s, Henry had ballooned to an estimated 400 pounds, his massive bulk requiring mechanical assistance to move around his palaces. This obesity exacerbated his circulation problems, made his leg ulcers worse, and put enormous strain on his heart and organs. The image of the king being hoisted into bed by pulleys and winches provides stark contrast to the athletic young man who had once vaulted onto horseback in full armor. Living and working in close proximity to Henry during his final years required considerable fortitude. The royal court, once the most prestigious environment in England, became a place where courtiers balanced ambition against physical revulsion. Perfumed handkerchiefs became essential accessories, and the strategic positioning of aromatic herbs and incense burners around the royal presence became a minor art form. Some nobles reportedly developed chronic respiratory problems from constantly breathing through their mouths to avoid the worst of the royal odor. The king's clothing presented particular challenges. His garments had to accommodate both his massive bulk, his waist measured an estimated 54 inches, and the constant discharge from his wounds. Elaborate systems of padding and absorbent materials were sewn into clothes requiring frequent changing throughout the day. Dining with the king became an ordeal, testing even the strongest stomachs, as elaborate feasts were dominated by competing scents of rich food and royal putrefaction. The servants charged with Henry's direct care faced the most challenging circumstances. Royal body servants found their duties transformed into something resembling medical orderlies in a plague hospital. The constant cleaning and dressing of wounds, management of soiled clothing and bedding, and general maintenance of a body in active decay required both strong stomachs and absolute discretion. Special rooms were designated for the messier aspects of the king's care, and schedules arranged to minimize witnesses to the worst aspects of his condition. Henry's physical deterioration had profound political consequences. The chronic pain, neurological damage, and psychological trauma fundamentally altered his approach to governance, turning an already autocratic monarch into a genuinely dangerous tyrant whose medical condition became a driving force in English politics. Between 1540 and 1547, Henry ordered the deaths of dozens of nobles, clergy, and commoners, often for crimes that would previously have merited lesser punishments. Historians have noted a clear correlation between worsening medical symptoms and escalating state violence. The case of Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, provides stark example of how his deteriorating condition affected political judgment. When Catherine's alleged adultery was discovered in 1541, Henry's reaction was so violent and irrational that even hardened courtiers were shocked. Contemporary accounts describe the king as nearly incoherent with rage, demanding not just Catherine's death, but elaborate tortures that advisors had to diplomatically discourage. The man who had once been capable of calculating political responses had been reduced to pure, vengeful emotion. Henry's medical problems also affected England's foreign policy significantly. His inability to participate personally in military campaigns forced him to rely increasingly on subordinates whose loyalty he constantly questioned. The paranoia resulting from his brain injury led him to suspect treachery everywhere, resulting in the execution of several competent military commanders when England could ill afford such losses. Perhaps most significantly, Henry's deteriorating condition affected the crucial question of royal succession. His obvious declining health made succession increasingly urgent, but his erratic behavior made it impossible to predict his choices. The complex maneuvering around succession during Henry's final years was driven not just by ambition, but by practical necessity of preparing for the death of a king whose medical condition made his demise increasingly inevitable. By the mid-1540s, Henry's body had become a battlefield of competing medical disasters. The leg ulcers had worsened dramatically, becoming deeper and more infected with each passing year. The French ambassador Charles de Marillac described a king whose leg is something putrefied and whose general health was so poor he could barely walk without assistance. Other diplomats reported that Henry's clothes had to be changed multiple times daily due to wound discharge, and special servants were employed solely for managing the king's medical needs. The king's daily routine became a grotesque parody of royal splendor. Where once he had held court while engaging in athletic pursuits, he now received visitors while having wounds dressed and cleaned. The elaborate rituals of monarchy continued, but overshadowed by the constant presence of physicians, the stench of putrefaction, and visible evidence of the king's physical decay. Henry's sleeping arrangements revealed the extent of his physical problems. His bed was equipped with mechanical devices to help him change positions, as his weight and infirmity made normal movement impossible. Special padding protected his ulcerated legs from pressure, and bedding required frequent changing due to wound discharge. The King of England required mechanical assistance to perform basic bodily functions. Most horrifying was the development of additional sores and ulcers beyond those on his legs. Contemporary accounts mention putrid boils covering other parts of his body, suggesting that circulatory problems and possible immune system dysfunction had created a general state of tissue breakdown. The king, who had once been admired throughout Europe for his physical beauty, had become a walking advertisement for human decay. By January 1547, it was clear to everyone at court that Henry VIII was dying, though no one dared speak this truth aloud. The last weeks of his life were marked by dramatic acceleration in physical decline. The leg ulcers began showing signs of serious infection, possibly developing into the gangrene that would ultimately kill him. Contemporary accounts describe wounds so putrid that even the king's physicians struggled to approach him, and royal apartments reeked so strongly of decay they required daily fumigation. Henry's mental state during these final weeks reflected the complex interaction of physical pain, medical deterioration, and psychological trauma. He alternated between periods of apparent lucidity, during which he continued conducting state business with characteristic attention to detail, and episodes of confusion or rage that terrified attendants. The brain that had once guided England through the complexities of the Reformation now struggled with basic cognitive functions. The king's eating habits became increasingly erratic as his condition worsened. Some days he would demand elaborate feasts he could barely consume, while others saw him refuse food entirely. His servants reported he would sometimes awaken in the middle of the night demanding specific dishes, only to reject them when prepared. The man who had once celebrated power through magnificent banquets was reduced to the confused food cravings of an invalid. Perhaps most poignantly, Henry's final weeks were marked by apparent awareness of his own mortality that contrasted sharply with the confident assumption of divine favor that had characterized most of his reign. He spent increasing time with chaplains, and several courtiers reported overhearing him praying with an intensity suggesting genuine fear of judgment. The king, who had defied the Pope and claimed authority over English souls, now faced the possibility that his own soul might be in jeopardy. On January 27, 1547, Henry's condition took a decisive turn for the worse. The infected ulcers on his legs appeared to have developed into systemic sepsis, as he developed high fever and altered consciousness that typically preceded death in such cases. His physicians, who had struggled for years to manage his various ailments, finally acknowledged their patient was beyond help. In the early hours of January 28, 1547, Henry VIII finally succumbed to the medical disasters that had tormented him for over a decade. The immediate cause was almost certainly sepsis resulting from his chronically infected leg ulcers. The gangrene that had been slowly spreading through damaged tissue finally overwhelmed his body's ability to fight infection, leading to systemic organ failure. Contemporary accounts describe his final hours as marked by delirium and difficulty breathing, symptoms consistent with septic shock. Unlike the peaceful deaths often described for medieval monarchs, Henry appears to have died as he had lived his final years, in discomfort and distress. The secrecy surrounding Henry's death reflects both political necessity of managing succession and the physical horror of his final condition. His body was so putrid by the time of death that immediate burial preparations were necessary, and traditional lying in state had to be abbreviated. The king, who had once been admired for physical magnificence, was hastily enclosed in his coffin to spare subjects the sight of his decayed remains. The official announcement of Henry's death was delayed for 3 days, during which the complex machinery of Tudor government was reorganized around the reality of a child king. Henry's body lay in state in a sealed coffin, elaborate funeral ceremonies proceeding with knowledge that the corpse they honored had been too putrid for public viewing. The elaborate lead coffin containing Henry's remains was as much practical necessity as mark of royal dignity. The death of Henry VIII marked the end not just of a reign, but of an era in English history. The specific circumstances of his death, the long decline, physical horror, and impact of medical conditions on governance, had consequences extending far beyond immediate succession crisis. The manner of Henry's death influenced how subsequent English monarchs approached royal health and medical care, leading to significant improvements in royal medical services and greater emphasis on preventing rather than treating royal ailments. Perhaps more significantly, knowledge that Henry VIII had died in such degraded physical state helped undermine some of the mystique surrounding royal power. While full details of his condition were kept secret during his lifetime, enough information eventually became public to challenge the notion that kings were somehow protected by divine favor from common afflictions of humanity. The medieval concept of the king's two bodies, the physical body that ages and dies, and the mystical body politic that endures forever, provides framework for understanding the horror and significance of Henry VIII's final years. In Henry's case, the grotesque decay of his physical body created unprecedented crisis for the institution of monarchy itself, as subjects were forced to reconcile reverence for royal authority with the repulsive reality of their sovereign's putrefaction. Henry VIII's death by degrees, the slow rotting away of his body over more than a decade, represents one of the most dramatic examples in history of how physical ailments can shape political events. The transformation of a vital young king into a diseased tyrant influenced every aspect of English governance, from religious policy to foreign relations to the basic question of succession. The king, who had once embodied the power and glory of Renaissance monarchy, became, in his final years, a living symbol of mortality and decay. The medical disasters that destroyed Henry's body also destroyed many assumptions about royal power that had sustained English monarchy for centuries. The knowledge that their king was literally rotting alive forced Henry's subjects to confront the fundamental humanity of their sovereign in ways that challenged traditional notions of divine kingship. The man who had claimed authority over English souls was revealed to be as subject to physical decay and mortality as any of his subjects. Perhaps most significantly, Henry's gruesome decline and death marked the end of an era in which royal power could be exercised purely through personal presence and physical intimidation. The king, who had once awed subjects through sheer physical magnificence, was reduced to ruling through fear and violence as his body betrayed him. This transition from charismatic to purely coercive authority would have lasting implications for the development of English government and the relationship between monarch and subjects. In the end, Henry VIII's death was as dramatic and consequential as his life, but for reasons he could never have anticipated. The king, who had sought immortality through political and religious reforms, instead achieved a different kind of lasting impact through the sheer horror of his physical decline. The stench that emanated from Henry's chambers in those final years was not just the smell of a dying man, but the odor of a dying system of absolute monarchy that could no longer sustain itself through the fiction of royal invincibility. In rotting alive, Henry VIII did not just destroy his own body, he helped to rot away some of the fundamental assumptions about royal power that had sustained English monarchy for centuries. His putrid death marked not just the end of his own reign, but the beginning of a new understanding of the relationship between the mortal bodies of kings and the immortal institution they represent.